Welcome everybody to today's presentation about data, the data security standard, and evidence-based design. Before I begin, I will quickly introduce both myself and SureCloud. SureCloud is a PCI QSA. It is also a PCI ASV, as well as a specialist penetration testing and information assurance company. We work across the globe with clients covering several sectors, from payment systems, financial systems, and elements of critical national infrastructure, including aviation and energy. Myself, I am a QSA at SureCloud. I've been here for the last 13 months. Before that, I was a QSA at a couple of other firms. Now, my experience covers both critical infrastructure and payment services at the individual business and indeed at the national level. My particular areas of focus is on the implementation of PCI DSS controls in highly complex distributed environments, including the use of cloud and mainframe environments, actually. So today, I'm going to talk to you about data. Why are we here? Well, I'll begin with the point of this workshop, or I should rather say my pet hate. My pet hate is the amount of hyperbole and fear that seem to rule in our industry. Every day, our business leaders are subjected to a barrage of headline-grabbing articles, such as the ones that we see in front of us, with cyber arms race and cyber 9/11s and lethal security threats that are going to neutralize productivity. Now, it's horrifying to see. It's horrifying to see because business leaders don't believe it. Business leaders are smart enough to understand that the only thing worth worrying about is something that is fact-based, something that is backed up with evidence. And if there isn't evidence, if it's just hyperbole and fear, and leaders in cybersecurity telling business folk that they have to do something because of a vague and poorly articulated threat, nobody will take that threat seriously. So I'm here to talk about how we can change that picture, how we can use data to inform our decision-making and ultimately help us as security professionals, whether we're QSAs or whether we're internal security subject matter experts, to implement the controls in the DSS, both version 3 and also moving into version 4 in a smarter way. So what do we need? Well, users respond better to risks and to threats that are reliable and credible. Now, to be reliable and credible, the risks and the threats need to be defended with evidence. And if we don't have the evidence, then what are we really asking users to do? Are we scaring them into doing something? Are we scaring business leaders into investing in something that even we don't fully understand? And that's an interesting question to ask. So, should we try facts? Well, Dr. Ian Levy, the security director of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, said in 2019 that actually we need to start adopting security policy that's driven by evidence and data rather than hyperbole and fear. And again, that's a point that's actually backed up back in 2015 with another academic study that talks about developing arguments based on reality and empirical realities rather than hyperbole and fear. Again, this is something that we have not been very good at in cyber and before that information security, but something that we absolutely need to pivot to adapt to. Now, we need more accurate detection, better security tools. We need to regain, and I think this is very, very key. We need to regain users' attention and respect. We cannot be tricking or scaring business leaders into investing in something that they and we don't fully understand. So do we now have an opportunity with PCI version 4 just around the corner, with custom validation routes, for example? Do we now have the opportunity to employ a data-driven approach to test and justify the controls that make sense in our individual payment environments, rather than just pointing at the PCI DSS and telling businesses that they have to do 100% of it 100% of the time? So for the first time, I think, with the introduction of PCI DSS version 4.0, we have an opportunity for both merchants and service providers to tailor their control set, to tailor controls to their individual environments. But that's only possible if we can decide defensively, with evidence, where and why those entities should deviate from the standard as written and actually employ their own control sets, or to focus more on those controls that matter with an evidenced backing. So, what data? What data are we talking about? I'm using the word data. What does that mean? We need to be data-driven. So, data-driven architectures, for example, are something that is a particular focus in the business world right now. Actually moving all elements of business, whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's account planning, from reactive detection to proactive prediction. And what we mean by this is moving away from a position where we're responding on the fly to something that's already happened, collecting tons of data in event logs and using that just for the purpose of documenting in a legal case what happened during a data breach. We're actually not using that before the fact to try and predict and prevent the data breach. This is especially important when we are talking about focusing our resources, and that can be budget, it can be time, it can be emotional energy invested in developing a security control set for a particular merchant or service provider environment with a limited amount of resource, and actually using data to drive that decision-making process rather than us putting a finger in the air and saying, I'm going to spend X amount of money here because that's what I read on the register. So why should we be data-driven? Well, quite simply, it's what the business needs. Businesses are crying out for data that they can take to guide them towards making better decisions, to setting and prioritizing their business goals, to monitoring progress and continually improving over time, planning interventions, and then evaluating the progress that they've made. This is something that every other business unit does day to day. One could not imagine, for example, a sales team leader approaching a senior leadership team and asking for budget to hire 10 more salespeople if they can't show the requisite numbers on paper. And yet in cybersecurity and information assurance before that, I think there's been this default behavior of asking for money and asking for attention from the business based on quite unquantifiable risks and vague threats that can't really be defined using a data set. I think that's a problem. And I think this is another important point. We cannot be great at everything all of the time. We can't. The PCI DSS, in the truest sense, asks organizations to comply with all of the requirements all of the time, and in many cases going above and beyond. And actually, that isn't sustainable. A business cannot comply with every requirement 100% of the time. There are some requirements that just don't matter as much as the next for particular environments. And therefore we need a defensible focus on the security controls that are really going to matter, the controls with the biggest tail, in other words. And it helps you to articulate what you need to business leaders. Saying to a business leader that an organization must do something because the standards say so is just not a compelling argument. It doesn't matter what the pseudo regulators at the SSC write in that document, because ultimately, outside of the payment services world, many business leaders don't necessarily care what's in the PCI DSS. They just want compliance obligations to be met, and budgets have to be targeted smartly. A business may have a whole host of security objectives to comply with. PCI DSS is just one of them. And therefore saying that we have to do something because PCI says so is a very, very, very weak argument. Instead, if we can go to a business and say, well, actually, we've collected and we have analyzed the data, trusted data, and we now have a 1,000-point data model that tells us precisely where a breach will occur according to our local merchant or service provider environment. That is a strong argument. It's a defensible and repeatable argument. So what does the DSS say about data? Not very much, I'm afraid to say. We do have a frequently asked question, FAQ 1254, that talks about the use of event log data to detect and to act upon potential indicators of compromise. But other than that, the DSS doesn't necessarily concern itself with the tailored approach. But of course, that may change with version 4. So data classes, very, very quickly, important to know what we mean when we say data. We have 2 data classes. The first is authoritative data. Authoritative data has the ability to stand alone. It is objective data. And that data can include things like CVSS scan results based on like-for-like tests in a consistent sample. And that's a trusted, independent data set. We then have a second type, and that is a non-authoritative data set. And this is where we have any kind of subjective data that has been created by humans, such as audits, assessment surveys, anything that isn't necessarily empirical. Then we have the important point to make that actually non-authoritative data, rather than being taken as a standalone data set, actually in many cases can be employed to speak to or to in fact, detract from the confidence that we have in an authoritative data set. So where do we find the data? Well, we're talking about PCI DSS, and we've got a ton of data that we're mandated by the DSS to actually collect and store. We have our antivirus logs, for example. We have intrusion and detection and prevention logs. We have WAF type logs. We have storage and application logs. We have access logs from IDAC controls, and we have administrative events across all system types. But we don't just have that. This is 2022. We all have access to much more data than what we're mandated to collect by the DSS. We also have access to things like change tags, for example, in automated deployment pipelines. We have open source intelligence from popular tools. These are two tools that I use in my day-to-day work that are fantastic at giving me real-world actionable intelligence, all with data points. Threat intelligence platforms such as the National Cybersecurity Center's Cyber Information Sharing Partnership, IBM X-Force, all great tools. And of course, root cause analysis according to the DSS. Root cause analysis, when done well, of course, allows us to pin, to stick a pin, if we will, in the events or actions that led up to the breach. Now, by noting those down and plotting those root causes, we can actually see where patterns are emerging. And that's what we're going to use today. We're going to look at patterns in breach. So, doing things with data, what do we do with it? We've collected our data, what can be done? For today's purposes, we are going to use PFI report data. So we're going to take some findings, we're going to take some root causes, and we're going to take some contributing factors from over 1,000 reports that have been collected over a multi-year period, and an average of 20 reports per month globally from varying industries. And we're going to look at what that data shows us in terms of us, with our business leader hat on, making informed decisions based on robust, authoritative and non-authoritative data sets. So we're going to start with the root cause analysis from 2018. In 2018, we can see that actually the outcome of PFI reports show us that requirement 6, or indeed no compliance with requirement 6, or limited compliance with that requirement, actually led directly to the breaches. And there's a tremendous bias towards requirement 6 here. We see that repeated in 2019. We still have this bias. In fact, it's an increasing bias towards non-compliance with requirement 6 that led to a breach. And we can see that play out over a multi-year period where we have this sustained bias towards a lack of compliance with requirement 6 as being the root cause of a data breach. Well, fantastic. That's useful information to have. If I'm a merchant or if I'm a service provider, I'm immediately thinking, well, golly, if all of these merchants or service providers, these entities have been breached and lack of compliance with requirement 6 is the root cause, perhaps that's where I want to focus my energies. We then have the contributing factors, and the contributing factors in the breaches again follow a similar trend where we have some very, very clear biases towards particular controls. So for example, requirement 6, again, software development, system maintenance. We have identity and access management and control in requirement 8, and we have problems with collecting and using data in requirement 10, and the testing of systems in requirement 11. This is how it looked in 2018. In 2019, we see the same bias. Again, if we look at that picture over a 4-year period, we see, again, a sustained bias towards those requirements. Now, actually, when we start to put this together, we come up with a very, very strong story. We have a story that says, if a business is likely to suffer a data breach, it will come from a very particular area of control deficiency. And as business folk, we can then put that argument to our peers and say, look, this is not my opinion anymore. This isn't me coming to you and saying we need to comply with every requirement of the PCI DSS and go above and beyond all the time. This is me saying, well, look, we have some very clear indicators potentially here as to where we need to focus our energy, focus our investment, and following through with that. So what do we do with the data? Well, we are going to tell a story. That's all we're going to do. We're going to use this data to tell a story. And to do that, we're going to use behavioral models that tell an impactful story to the recipient, i.e. we're going to tailor the story that we're telling with our data to the recipient. So if I know in my organization that my senior leadership team in the C-suite are focused on mission, and they're focused on product, and they're focused on constituents, and they're focused on stakeholder returns, that is the frame that I'm going to use when describing my data. Likewise, if I'm talking to operational management, I'm going to be talking about routines, procedures, and day-to-day processes. So how do we do this? We collect and present. There are all sorts of tools that we can utilize. This is an elk stack, for example, that is talking here actually about malware detection, but there are fantastic tools on the market, both commercial and open source, that will allow you to take data, to aggregate, analyze that data, and run off human readable results, data stories with those data sets. So where do we go with custom validation? Do we have a data-driven approach? Yes, absolutely. I have some examples here for you, things that I would immediately jump on with version 4 custom validation routes. So for example, 6.4.6, major change. What is a significant or major change with regards to the DSS? And do you as an organization know how many major changes that you're undertaking each year? It's an interesting question. Well, what about 12.10.3? Having humans to respond to alerts to the various happenings on your networks and systems on a 24/7 basis. Well, how can a data-driven approach change that? Well, what if we have Azure Sentinel or Darktrace appliances actually analyzing and responding to alerts on our behalf, quarantining traffic, for example, where that traffic fails a pattern detection algorithm based on robust data sets? What about analyzing significant changes if they meet a certain criterion set by us, again, using repeatable data sets, and actually picking out in an automated pipeline build process a significant change and flagging it for a human review where necessary, and having other changes pass through an automated pipeline? That's a really interesting question. All possible if we employ the data for useful business objectives. So, playing with PCI. Are we playing well with PCI? Well, yes. I'm often asked by merchants why they should be expected to go above and beyond, and I point them quite literally to paragraph 3 of the standard itself, currently as written in version 3.2.1, where we see that the DSS is a minimum set of requirements. Absolutely, everybody should be striving to go above and beyond. So, my key messages. Baseline compliance is okay. It's fine. There's no shame in just scraping through those requirements where the data says you are unlikely to have a breach. If you are a software development company, I would much rather you focus your elements on of investment on requirement 6 and get requirement 6 absolutely squared away than I would you messing around with requirement 9 controls. And I don't think any QSA could really argue against that. And the last point to make, I think, is that we have to use the data to improve our internal learning. Our internal learning is what drives the improvement to data sets, to data modeling, and what we need to collect and why and where we employ that. So continually learning using the data, pivoting where we need to pivot. Perhaps requirement 6 is no longer the critical control. Perhaps it's now requirement 10. Well, fine, let's pivot over to that because the data is telling us to do that, and we've learned as we go. So that brings us to the end of the conversation. If you would like to argue with me on any of these points or have a robust discussion, I'm always open for it. My email is in front of you, and I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody. And you can also follow us on the Twitters and the LinkedIns and the Instagrams and all the rest of it. We do put up some good content, including me occasionally ranting about things other than data. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks for listening, and have a rest of a good day.